Okay, let's talk about blood sugar. Blood sugar is called glucose. So, when we eat food or we drink, the body will break all of the carbohydrates down and the proteins down and the fats down and into its smaller components, nutritive components, and we get from the carbohydrates is glucose, which is blood sugar. Okay? Glucose is fuel. Glucose needs to be transported into the various cells of our body so that our cells can use that fuel energy source to produce energy. That's what it all comes down to, energy production. Right, let me go to a diagram. I think it's a lot easier to understand this. Okay. Let's just call this an individual cell. Our bodies are made up of arguably 70 trillion plus cells. We have a collection of cells that makes up the cardiovascular system, the heart tissue, the arteries and the veins. Many of those are called endothelial tissues. We have cells that make up the digestive system, cells that make up our pulmonary system, but collectively, okay, we are made up of individual cells, and each cell into itself is a life force. And each cell into itself requires the production of energy. Okay? So what has to happen is that when we eat our foods is glucose goes up. Glucose goes up. So as soon as the glucose goes up, when the blood sugar level rises, is our pancreas secretes from what is we call the islet cells in the pancreas, secretes a hormone, and that hormone is known as insulin. Insulin is the hormone or the transport mechanism for glucose. Glucose needs to get inside this cell, but it cannot get inside this cell on its own. It requires a transport mechanism, and that transport mechanism is insulin. So insulin grabs the glucose and travels through the circulation, and it looks for receptors on the cell wall. So on the cell wall you have receptors, okay, for insulin. Insulin will transport the glucose around. When it can locate the insulin receptor, it will bind onto the receptor, and it allows the glucose to enter into the cell. Now inside that cell, the glucose is utilized through a chemical process known as the citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle, and basically the end result is that it's going to produce, I should use a different color, right? It's going to produce an ATP molecule. ATP molecule. The ATP molecule, okay, is our energy molecule. So the end product of glucose metabolism is to produce ATP, which is an energy molecule. So as you can see, the very essence is that glucose needs to be transported into the cell. Inside the cell is converted through the citric acid cycle to form the ATP energy molecule. And then the byproduct is going to be some toxic free radicals that are produced, that hopefully that are neutralized and then exported out of the body. Okay? It's very similar to driving your car up to a gas station, filling your gas tank up with gas. Right, that gas has got to get into the engine, combust, where it then produces energy where the car can go down the street. Right? So it's very much the same type of thing. Now many mechanisms are involved with this transportation and the ability to get this glucose into the cell. So when we hear about diabetes, or let's talk insulin resistance, because diabetes is really an insulin resistant problem, meaning that the cell has become resistant to insulin. The cell hasn't become resistant to glucose. The cell has become resistant to insulin. So if it becomes resistant to insulin, these receptors can basically burn out. And so what happens is we eat the food or we drink the juice and the glucose goes up. Immediately our body sees that. The pancreas releases insulin to transport the glucose through the circulation to find the cell receptors. If the receptors are burning out, there's nowhere for insulin to attach to it. It can't get the glucose into the cell, and the glucose is just going through the blood system. That's why when you take a fasting blood glucose, we'll see those numbers elevated. Fasting glucose means that the glucose level is too high in the blood because it's not in the cell. So, when you get your blood test back, let's talk about the numbers. According to the American Diabetic Association, when you do a fasting blood glucose test, meaning that you should go a minimum of 9 hours without food. When we take the blood sample, if your blood glucose is, I'm running out of space here, right? 126 or above, that number is the cutoff number according to the American Diabetic Association. 126 or higher, you're diabetic. That's considered clinically diabetes. If the number is between 100 to 125, okay, that is considered pre-diabetic. So the 27 million Americans that we're talking about are already here. That doesn't count all the people that are considered pre-diabetics. That's why this condition is epidemic. Functional medicine says to us that to really be well, that our numbers, blood glucose numbers, fasting glucose, should really be between 85 to 99. And the most current research is even telling us now that number should probably be a bit lower than that. But what I need you to really just understand at this particular point is that diabetes or insulin resistance is basically a fuel delivery problem into the cell. So why is this a degenerative disease? So if we understand that insulin resistance is truly a fuel delivery problem, an inability to get the glucose, the fuel source for the cell, we can't get it into the cell, then we can't produce energy. Now the interesting thing is that our brains live solely on glucose and oxygen. Our brain tissue itself utilizes 20% of our overall glucose demand.